Okay, welcome to this seminar on liberalism, the past and the future of liberalism. It's good to see you here, so many of you, in this beautiful evening in Stockholm. I'm Björn Hasselgren. I'm a senior fellow here at Timbro, working with moral philosophy and the constitutional matters and so on, how our societies should be formed within a liberal framework. And of course, there could be no better place to discuss liberalism than at Timbro, since we are for free markets, open societies, and personal freedom. And this is what we are going to discuss tonight. We have two distinguished guests to start with. Professor Helena Rosenblatt from City University of New York. She has a number of books on her track record around famous liberal figures in the history. The last one, or most recent of your books, perhaps, is The Lost History of Liberalism, which is the basis for the discussion today, an attempt to draw the long lines of history of liberalism and where it's heading in the future. So good to have you here. And we have Dan Klein, Professor Dan Klein, also a good friend of Timbro, with a number of seminars that we have done on liberalism. And you are heading an Adam Smith program at George Mason University in the US. Could perhaps say a specialist in Adam Smith. And so I think this will be a very interesting exchange. I think Helena's book is very interesting because it really draws out the long lines of liberalism's history. And it tries to also define where we are heading and perhaps why things happened as they did. And I think Dan will not agree in all parts, and that will be the basis of the discussion. But I thought that I could read, I think, one of the last sentences of your book, Helena. It says, liberals should reconnect with the resources of their liberal tradition to recover, understand, and embrace its core values. And I think that's really something to look ahead for. As I get it when I read your book, I think it's something, and the seminar that we're having today is something about discussing, where is the start, or one start of liberalism? Is it Adam Smith, The Moral Sentiments? It's not the favorite edition, but your favorite book. I know you hate this edition. Or is it more to it? Is it also that there is a wider background where liberals also were interested in the common good in another way, in a European way? And right now I'm reading Hegel, Elements of the Philosophy of Right, which might be one of these. The French liberals, Constant, is also one that you are mentioning in your book. So perhaps between these two books could be something of what we are going to discuss tonight. We will start with Helena giving a presentation, and we will give the floor then to Dan, and then there will be an exchange and also questions from the audience. And we are to finalize by 7 o'clock, and then it's possible to go on to discuss these matters afterwards. So could we give a big hand to both of you, perhaps? And Helena, please take the scene.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Timbro. Thank you, especially Björn Hasselgren. Thank you, Dan Klein, both of you for organizing this thing. And thank you all for coming. Thank you to my family, who's here in full force. My Swedish family. The threat of rising populism, in Europe at least, has perhaps been attenuated somewhat by the recent EU elections, but the fear of populism remains palpable. The warnings have been growing louder and more emphatic. Liberalism is in crisis. The 2019 Timbro Authoritarian Populism Index appears to confirm this. It shows that authoritarian populism has established itself as the third ideological force in Europe. On average, around a fifth or even a quarter of the European electorate now vote for a left or right-wing populist party, and populist parties are part of every third European government. This is also why The Economist, the journal, recently issued what it called a liberal manifesto. Liberalism made the modern world, the journal said, but the world is turning against it. It then presented some alarming statistics. In polling last year, just 36% of Americans, 24% of Canadians, and only 9% of the French thought that the next generation would be better off than their parents. Only a third of Americans under 35 say that it's vital that they live in a democracy. The share who would welcome military government grew from 7% in 1995 to 18% last year. Globally, according to Freedom House, civil liberties and political rights have declined for the past 12 years. In 2017, 71 countries lost ground, while only 35 made gains. Liberal democracy seems threatened in a way none of us could have imagined just a few years ago, even in America with Donald Trump. It's not just that liberalism is losing adherents or being attacked by adversaries. An additional problem frequently lamented in America is that liberals are divided. The divisions are visible in the very labels they use to describe them. Many use the word liberal as a catch-all to describe left-of-center politics in general. But self-described leftists and members of the so-called Democratic Socialists of America often characterize liberals as their opponents, viewing them as standing in the way of a more progressive or socialist agenda. A recent poll suggests that what liberal means to people could be a factor of age. People 50 and older say that Joe Biden is liberal. Younger voters say that Bernie Sanders is. But then we also have the American libertarians, like my friend Dan Klein, who claim that they are the true, in other words, classical liberals. There are, of course, additional curiosities and oddities. In much of Europe and the rest of the world, being liberal generally means being right of center, favoring free markets and less regulation, while in America, colloquially, it means big government or left of center. Liberalism's central problem, continues The Economist, is that it has lost sight of its essential values. Agreeing with this proposition, some are asking what liberalism's essential values are. In this moment of peril, can these different types of liberals find common ground to counter a threat that endangers us all? So today I thought I might do the following. I think my book, The Lost History of Liberalism, can lend perspective and shed some light on these important questions. So I'll begin by speaking briefly about what led me to write my book and why I adopted a new approach to the history of liberalism. Then I have selected 3 or 4 discoveries that this method has led me to, and will tentatively suggest some lessons that we might draw from them today. So 1, why I wrote this book. While working on my first books, one on Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the second on Benjamin Constant, and a number of articles on other political thinkers, I became aware of a curious fact. There didn't actually exist a book on the proper history of liberalism, at least not anything with the kind of time span and scope that I thought the topic deserved. There are books on individual thinkers, books on liberal statesmen, books on liberal parties, books attacking liberalism, books defending liberalism, but no comprehensive history of liberalism. Given its importance to the Western world, I thought this odd, and I was attracted by the challenge. But when I embarked on the project of writing this history of liberalism, I immediately encountered some perplexing oddities and contradictions, some of which I just mentioned. They all had to do with defining liberalism. There are different definitions out there. Why was it, I wondered, that liberalism in colloquial parlance means one thing in Europe and something else in the United States? Why do so-called libertarians speak of a classical liberalism that they find is more authentic than today's? And why are there so many different founders of liberalism? Some call Machiavelli or Hobbes founders, while others speak of John Locke, Adam Smith, or even Jesus Christ. How can they all be founders of liberalism when they are so radically different? While pondering these and similar questions, I couldn't help noticing that liberalism was often called a slippery or vague concept in the books and articles that I read. The most serious scholars discussing liberalism often confess that it's hard to define. But then what they do is simply stipulate a personal definition and refer to a number of thinkers and concepts from the past to back them up. In fact, cherry-picking ideas and writers from the past that support their own definitions. As an historian, I find this deeply problematic. When you adopt such an approach, you are in fact projecting your own views on the past. You are not telling the history of liberalism. You are explaining your own views with a few selective references to the past, and moreover, the past as you see it. Picking thinkers and ideas out of context and lining them up in chronological order to support your own views does not constitute doing history to me. And it results in all these different, conflicting, or at least confusing definitions of liberalism, a term that is so important to our political discussions. So the question I grappled with was how to write a history of liberalism when we don't agree on what it is, or when we disagree about who its founders are and who should be included in the canon. I couldn't just stipulate my own definition, choose my own canon, and do what others were doing. So I chose another way. I decided to let those in the past speak for themselves. In my book, I trace the history of what the words liberal and liberalism meant to the people who employed the words from ancient Rome until today. I tried to answer the following questions, among others. What did liberal mean to the people who used the term 2,000 years ago? And how did that meaning change over time? When was the first Liberal Party formed, and what did it stand for? When was the word liberalism coined? Why was it coined? And what did it mean to the people who used it? And by people, I just don't mean the great thinkers, the great canon, Locke, Smith, etc., but journalists, statesmen, and writers of all kinds who have left records. My approach leads to a number of interesting and surprising findings. First, discovery. The Anglo-American liberal tradition is an after-the-fact construction and myth. What do I mean by that? We are often told that liberalism is an age-old and venerable Anglo-American tradition with roots stretching far back into English history. Many trace its origins as far back as the Magna Carta of 1215 and then dwell on John Locke. Others focus on Adam Smith and David Hume. From Britain, liberalism is said to have spread slowly and gained acceptance until it was transported to America. There, its principles were enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution. During the 19th century, liberalism continued its steady and inexorable progress until it became the dominant doctrine of the West. This is a nice story, but it's also inaccurate. Liberalism, as a word and cluster of ideas, emerged in France in the wake of the French Revolution, and not before. The word was coined in or around 1810. Among liberalism's first theorists were Benjamin Constant and Madame de Staël, not Machiavelli, not John Locke, and not Adam Smith. You, the audience here, may already know that the first liberal party that was called a Liberal Party was formed in Sweden and not Britain. And the truth is that for most of the 19th century, liberalism was widely seen as a French doctrine, closely associated with the country's successive revolutions, 1789, 1830, 1848, and 1871. The Encyclopedia Americana of 1831 didn't even contain an entry on liberalism, and the article on liberal explained that its political meaning came from France. Only half a century later was liberalism given an entry in the American Encyclopedia of Political Science, and even then, it was a translation of a French article equating liberalism with the principles of the French Revolution. As late as the closing years of the 19th century, liberal was sometimes spelled libéral with an E at the end, or rendered in italics to indicate its foreignness. Secondly, as it turns out, Germany played a central role in the history of liberalism. Liberals tended to be pragmatic reformers who adapted their principles to the problems at hand. The first liberals fought mainly for the rule of law, civic equality, representative and constitutional government, with a number of guaranteed rights, among which, by the way, only one was property. Their emphasis tended to be freedom of religion and the press. As new problems arose over the course of the 19th century, liberals broadened their focus to other things as well. They saw that industrialization was generating great wealth, but also huge income disparities, and what came to be seen as endemic poverty, something people began to call pauperism, also a new word invented in the 19th century. Liberals now became interested in ideas coming from Germany, where a new school of political economists were advocating increased government intervention in the economy to help the poor. Their ideas were translated and disseminated in France, Britain, and elsewhere. All of this led to what some people in Britain began to call new liberalism. Some became open to socialist ideas and said so openly. The term socialist liberal or liberal socialists were coined. By the beginning of the 20th century, British new liberals simply dropped the new and just spoke of liberalism. Objecting, however, to this move towards increased government interventionism, other liberals called themselves classical or orthodox liberals, claiming that they were more faithful to the founders. A debate occurred, which in fact continues to today. This new liberalism, that no longer called itself new, was imported into America and disseminated in the second decade of the 20th century. It didn't happen quite this way in Europe, which is why liberalism here tends to mean something different. In Europe during the 19th century, you still had to call yourself, or you had to call yourself a progressive liberal, a constructive liberal, or even a socialist liberal, to refer to what most Americans called simply liberal. In America, however, not everyone agreed with this use of the term. There were those who also said that these self-titled liberals were betraying the principles of classical liberalism. They were no longer orthodox. True liberalism, they said, stood for free markets and little or no interference by the government in the economy. The argument became heated during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency when he and his supporters used the term liberal to describe the government programs and projects of the New Deal. The former president, Herbert Hoover, who presided over the stock market crash of 1929, objected vehemently to this use of the term. In the end, however, FDR won the battle, perhaps simply by hammering his message home. In the speech nominating him as the Democratic candidate for the presidency in 1944, the word liberal was used no fewer than 15 times. And in one instance, the president was called the greatest liberal in the history of the United States. Herbert Hoover was obliged to acknowledge defeat. With great bitterness, he conceded that he would no longer use the word liberal. The word has been polluted and raped of all its real meaning, he said. But in Europe, the battle continued. The Austrians, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, for example, begged Britons and Americans to return to the old liberalism and insisted that the concept of a liberal socialism was a contradiction in terms. It was a German import, which invariably would lead to serfdom and totalitarianism. Eventually, many of their sympathizers in America took the name libertarian or called themselves, as many do today, classical liberals. Anyway, all this bickering back and forth about true liberalism in the mid-20th century should not blind us to an important but little-known fact. For it was then, and not before, that is, in the mid-20th century, that liberalism suddenly became an Anglo-American tradition, with John Locke as a founding father. It happened, I argue, because of the 2 world wars. It was decided that the young American soldiers needed to know what they were fighting for, and it was then reinforced, I would say, by the Cold War. The threat of totalitarianism, a new word invented at the time, in other words, the threat of fascism, Nazism, and communism, made it critical that America have a safe ideological ancestor, someone who was, first of all, from the right country, an ally, and who secondly could be read as a staunch defender of individual rights, and during the Cold War, especially property rights. John Locke was the perfect candidate, and France and Germany were essentially written out of the history of liberalism. The great American philosopher Richard Rorty once said, "Like the history of anything else, history of philosophy is written by the victors. Victors get to choose their ancestors." Now, what are the timely lessons we can draw from this? First, the idea that there's a true liberalism is false. If you adopt a genuinely historical and objective perspective, you have to conclude that liberalism has been and remains a contested and evolving term. To speak of classical liberalism as a true liberalism is a distortion of history. It's a term invented and used for political purposes. Moreover, having studied the 19th century, I would even venture to say that there never was anything in history resembling what today is called classical liberalism. It's a pure invention. My friend Dan Klein will disagree. Second, I suggest to you that the story we've been telling ourselves since the mid-20th century, and especially the Cold War, a story about a steadily advancing and providential Anglo-American tradition, besides being a myth, encourage us to think of liberal democracy as something inevitable, even foreordained. We often hear the suggestion that principles of liberal democracy are on the right side of history, a term President Obama often used. Its peaceful and progressive advance is somehow assumed to be inevitable because it is so obviously reasonable and right. This is a reassuring thought, but has it made us dangerously complacent, oblivious to its fragility, deaf to the dangers that continue to confront it? If liberal democracy is on the right side of history, perhaps we could just stand aside and let history play itself out. But the notion that the history of liberalism was somehow peaceful and smooth and inexorable is a myth. Liberalism was born of revolution and met with fierce resistance from the very beginning. Liberals faced overwhelming odds against the forces of reaction, whether from the left or the right. Liberalism's progress was characterized by fits and starts, reversals and regressions. There was nothing inevitable about its success. It was a fighting faith. In America, we lament the incivility and even the ugliness of today's political discourse. I frankly don't know if it's the same here. But anyway, believe me, things weren't better in the 19th century. In fact, evidence suggests that the word liberalism itself was coined as a term of abuse, an insult. Isms were generally pejorative terms and often referred to religious heresies. Anabaptism, Calvinism, Lutheranism, and now liberalism, which was also called by its adversaries a religio-political heresy. Because liberals advocated religious toleration and church-state separation, they were called atheists. Because they championed free press, they were called anarchists. Because they attacked the privileges of the nobility and churches, they were called selfish. And when they advocated the right to divorce and later birth control, they were accused of destroying the family. Liberalism's most formidable enemy in the 19th century was undoubtedly the throne and altar alliance, the combined forces of religion and reaction. And let me give you just a few quotations from my book to give you a flavor of this. Liberals were called satanic, demonic, sexually perverse. Liberalism was an influenza, a moral plague, the very principle of Satan. Liberals, their adversaries said, were not just bent on destroying the family, the community, religion, but they hated God. The strongest criticism came from the Catholic Church. In a pamphlet titled simply, "Liberalism is Sin," a Catholic spokesman for the Pope characteristically called liberalism, this is a long quote, "a greater sin than blasphemy, theft, adultery, homicide, or any violation of the law of God." With the rise of socialism, liberalism was also attacked from the left as a selfish ideology representing the rise of a money-grubbing bourgeoisie. Policies liberals pursued, wrote one socialist critic, were murderous. A small number of rich people were growing richer, while for the rest, life was a social hell. Liberals were accused of lacking in sympathy, generosity, and humanity. So liberals in the 19th century would have been amused by our concerns about civility. They were spied upon, they were arrested, and they were forced into exile. That's the true history of liberalism, attacked from all sides. Third lesson, the phenomenon of populism, or what some call illiberal democracy, today would not have surprised early liberals. By these terms, I mean popular governments, in principle elected democratically, but which put in place authoritarian rulers, despots and demagogues who claim to represent the people, but govern in a manner that erodes fundamental liberal principles, the rule of law, checks and balances, individual rights, like freedom of the press, and yet they remain popular. This is what we mean when we speak of illiberal democracies. And recall Viktor Orban of Hungary's trumpeting, openly advocating the idea of an illiberal democracy. Indeed, a common mistake that many make, at least in America, is to conflate liberalism with democracy or to think that they are natural allies. Liberal democracy, even conservatives in America favor that. But the two concepts are not synonyms and should not be confused. 19th century liberals, the first liberals, did not confuse them. For most of their history, democracy and liberalism have not even been compatible. From the time of the ancient Greeks, democracy has meant rule by the people, or people power. Some have interpreted this to mean direct political participation by all male citizens. Either way, others have taken it to mean a representative system based on the suffrage of all male citizens. Either way, however, well into the 19th century, the majority of liberals were hostile to the idea of democracy, and which they associated with chaos and mob rule. The French Revolution proved to liberals like them that the public was utterly unprepared for political rights. People were ignorant, irrational, and prone to violence. Under their pressure, during the radical phase of the revolution, the rule of law had been suspended, enemies of the people guillotined, rights trampled upon. The most democratic phase of the revolution had also been the most bloody. In the 19th century, liberals watched with frustration as demagogues and dictators manipulated the electorate by appealing to its lowest instincts and gullibility in order to enhance their own power and line their own pockets and those of their friends. Napoleon I, Napoleon III, Bismarck, again and again, these demagogues and dictators ignored, trampled, and abolished the rights and safeguards that liberals fought so hard for. And yet they remain popular. During the heyday of what is often called classical liberalism, it is hard to find a liberal who was enthusiastic about democracy. Indeed, it would not be wrong to say that liberalism was originally invented to contain democracy. So the charge of elitism is not entirely off the mark. People needed capacity to exercise the right to vote. Actually, yeah, the vote. They didn't want it to be a right. This required a certain amount of independence, the vote, which meant some money and education. Indeed, yet another discovery I made while writing this book is how much time liberals of all varieties devoted to education and morals. Today, we are so very much obsessed with individual rights, individual freedoms, individual choices, and we associate these with the great so-called Anglo-American tradition. But consider the fact that the word liberal stems from the Latin term liber, which meant free. We often hear that. But what is rarely said is that the word also meant generous. There was also the term liberalis, which referred to the values befitting a free-born person. To the ancient Romans, being free required citizens who practiced liberalitas. In other words, a noble and generous way of thinking and behaving required of a citizen. The opposite of liberalitas was selfishness, or what the Romans called slavishness, a way of thinking or acting that regarded only oneself, one's profits and pleasures. To be liberal meant being a good citizen and to be devoted to the common good. For this, a liberal arts education was needed. It trained future citizens for the duties and rewards of citizenship. It was something to aspire to. The liberals I encountered while writing this book were true to that liberal tradition. They were optimists about human nature and moralists at heart. They remained true to the double meaning of liber, freedom and generosity. 19th century liberals, the inventors of liberalism, spent at least as much time on duties and civics and how to foster the values essential to good citizenship as they did on rights. Laws without morals are useless, they said. Liberal constitutions without patriotism, civic values cannot survive. Liberal democracy is impossible without them. They worried greatly about civic privatism. In other words, when people became too focused on their economic interests and individual pleasures. Benjamin Constant spoke eloquently about politics as a noble vocation, higher than the pursuit of private pleasures. He warned against the tendency to economize liberty and to think too much of material rewards. Man, he wrote, had a higher purpose, a more noble, moral purpose. With a strong commitment to human dignity, Constant believed that human beings were fundamentally good. The focus on self-interest and material enrichment had a depoliticizing and corrupting effect. It made people submissive toward authority and the state, and created opportunities for domestic despotism. A focus on the accumulation of property and personal comforts promoted the wrong values. It created not citizens, but industrial animals, worker bees, whose well-ordered hives and skillfully constructed cells could never be the great ideal of humankind. Man had a higher vocation. So to conclude, and before I hand the mic over to Dan, I think an important lesson history can tell us is that at this critical time for liberal democracy is, again, that liberalism has never been a unified creed. Liberals debated liberalism's complex and fraught relationship with democracy, with individual rights, with economic policy, and with religion. They argued over what the size of the electorate should be. Late in the 19th century, they debated liberalism's relationship with socialism, whether property was an individual right or a social convention. And during the whole period, they debated how exportable liberalism's principles were to the rest of the world. But one certain conclusion we can draw from the history is that when faced with demagogues and would-be dictators, they were strongest when they could find common ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena. Just one question before we give the floor to Dan. And I think you give a picture of the development of liberalism or liberalis or whatever you call it. Either it's very confusing or it's a rich history. I tend to see it as a rich history with many different angles on it. But one thing, when you say that we shouldn't start with the Anglo-Saxons and that there is really perhaps no classical liberal tradition, then you have to answer the research-like question. Where did the values of the French Revolution come from?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you could perhaps keep that question.
Absolutely. I'm not terribly interested in where the ideas came from. Okay, you could do that, but to say that of course they read Adam Smith. Of course they read Hume. Benjamin Constant read him, but which Adam Smith did he read? And he also read, because, you can interpret Adam Smith differently. Some people interpret him. Well, we can talk that later in the debate. They also read other people that are not known to us. So, and where do you start deciding which one was a greater influence than another one? It's very hard to prove influence. It's very hard to make that decision. Do you say it's because they quote somebody? How about often they didn't quote somebody and they were even more influenced by that one? Do you say that it's because they had the book in their library? Well, we all know that we have books in our library that we never read. Right? So, and I'm more interested in the question, sorry, I'm going on a little bit, but I'm more interested in the question like, when did Adam Smith become considered a founding father? When did we decide that he's the inventor of liberalism? Right? And so I'm deliberately provocative in this book. I want to reset the debate. I want people to stop with the anachronism. I want people at least to know that when they say Adam Smith is the founder of liberalism and this is what Adam Smith meant, they are making a political intervention. They're not doing history.
Okay, good. Now, Dan.
Oh, thank you. Hey, everybody. I don't know, is making a political intervention and doing history mutually inconsistent? I mean, you can do both, no? Anyway, thanks for being here. Thanks to Timbro, and thanks especially to Helena, who back in, I think, about November, reached out to me. She had written her wonderful book, which I had already received and started reading. And you contacted me, and we fell into this conversation, which we've been continuing with great pleasure on, I think, both our parts. So I've got a bunch of slides. I've got to look at the screen. Oops, let's see, where are we? Oops, that's the last slide. That's the third slide. Oh. Someone's taking over. Okay. All righty, great. There have been a number of books in recent years searching for the meaning and history of liberalism. I think Helena's right that her book is especially rich in the history and in that span and scope that she spoke of. It's really quite remarkable, her book. I've learned a great deal with it. You should see my copy, what it looks like. You wouldn't believe how many books I've purchased from Bookfinder because you made me go check your interpretation. And so we do have disagreements, but it's been a great experience raising big questions. What does politics mean to us? Who we are even, or what? Where we should begin the story. Beginning here would be nice if we had enough time. Let's be modest and begin with 1440, talk about an emergence. I want to focus on these years especially, and look at what emerged, what's that story, and what was its name. Well, the name, as you know, is liberalism. Now, sometimes it's suggested that it's not apt or proper to call Adam Smith, say, a liberal, because the word liberalism, in fact, didn't come to English until about 1820, and in other countries, maybe 1810, like Spain or France. On that logic, we'd have to say that there wasn't protectionism until 1860, and there wasn't conservatism until 1830, and there wasn't racism or sexism until 1940. So I don't think this logic works. I mean, the word liberalism comes from expressions using the new political meaning, the first political meaning of the word liberal, turning that into a noun, just as Helena said, often as a pejorative. And there's two perspectives on this, on the inception of the first political meaning. One is the idea that Britain imported it from the continent, that it started on the continent and Britain imported it. And I think Helen is broadly in this camp. Certain passages certainly sound that way. She does acknowledge Smith's use of the word liberal, but by and large, I see Helena with this group, and that's in contrast to the Hayek thesis. He says it is often suggested that the term liberal derives from the early 19th century Spanish party of the liberales on the heels of the French Revolution. I am more inclined to believe that it derives from the use of the term by Adam Smith in such passages that we'll look at in The Wealth of Nations. Well, I am always one to agree with Hayek, so, it's just my destiny. So what is it that emerged? We had traditional society, if you will, 1400s. Kings and clerics lead society, tending and the higher things spiritually in terms of human meaning, and very much seeing all of life, the mundane things, the profane things as well, as serving those higher things led by these political and cultural leaders. And then the printing press came, and interpretation was blown wide open. We got disjointed interpretation. The Reformation, wars of religion. This was huge. Finally, out of exhaustion, perhaps, toleration ideas, and the idea of the rise of the nation state coming out of, in a way, print culture and the public or the people that the printing press created. And the political thought then changed the orientation in political theory from leading and tending those higher things to, hey, maybe what we need to do is sort out the lower things, create an operating system, and let people more do their own thing and pursue the higher things more as they see fit. And that's the idea of religious toleration, and eventually even in the First Amendment in the Constitution of the United States, a kind of separation of church and state. Natural jurisprudence was the chief literature doing this sorting out of the lower rights and duties. And there's a great deal of important thinkers doing that up until the time of Adam Smith. And he then takes that and teaches that, does political economy, and turns it into the liberal plan or the liberal system, his signal expressions. These are some of those natural jurisprudence. There's many, many more. And it's important to realize that this natural law, natural jurisprudence extends to Hume. Sometimes Hume's thought of as a contrast to natural law. He's actually more, in a lot of ways, a refiner, I think, of it, as this scholar and others argue. And so in terms of a sort of genealogy, we can take these natural jurisprudence, political theory people, and then recognize that it's only in Hume's time that political stability comes to Britain, that political instability, and in some sense perpetual crisis, was typical in the European experience. But Britain remarkably achieved a kind of political stability in Hume's time. He's essentially the same as Smith, they're buddies, if you don't know. And Smith, brings the word liberal forward in a new political meaning. Okay, in this huge way. And then we get the liberal era represented by the Liberal Party in Britain, for example, like Richard Cobden, John Bright, and four-time Prime Minister Gladstone. We could take this idea of liberal and extend it backward and think of those people perhaps as proto-liberals. I'm not so keen to call Grotius a liberal, but I'm really content to call Hume and Smith a liberal. Or liberal. His first book very much treats the virtues or duties you are to practice. And one of the special virtues is commutative justice, the sacred laws of which are not messing with your neighbor's person, okay, not messing with his property, these tangible things like this, and not messing with promises due or contract. This is one of the most important virtues he emphasizes. And you could put it as not messing with other people's stuff And the work of that natural jurisprudence was to discuss, okay, what is stuff? What counts as stuff? When is it a contract? What makes something property? When does it count as property? Whose is it? Is it mine? Is it yours? Is it the community's? Is it unowned? These are things that you get in Pufendorf and Grotius and Carmichael and Hutchison and so on. And what counts as messing with it? Okay? All these issues of trespass, negligence, torts, everything else. This is all like stuff that they're working out. That's the lower things operating system that's reorienting everything. This is all up to Adam Smith. These are understood within a historical context, just as every society has sort of its own grammar, but the grammars all have certain logics. And so there's a sort of uniformity amidst the variety of how they might, distinguish some of these concepts. And you can see that as kind of any society that's going to survive, we have to not be messing with each other's stuff too much. If we're messing with each other's stuff, we're not going to invest and prosper and even survive. So it's a kind of necessary convention or natural convention. That's not messing with other people's stuff. It has a natural flip side, others not messing with your stuff. Now, in relationships between equals, like you and your neighbor, Smith would call that security, like home security. But in the political relationship between the superior and the inferior, governor and governed, liberty, or natural liberty. Okay? And you can see this flip side relationship clearly in Smith, for example, in that passage right there. So you see this CJ liberty thing as a flip side concept that's very much the spine of liberalism 1.0, as I call it. It's very much the main idea in The Wealth of Nations, which then morally authorizes the pursuit of honest income, because he says this conduces to the general good, to universal benevolence, and he morally authorizes a presumption of liberty in policy to the legislator, to the statesman. And so you can think of this as this commutative justice idea being this core central thing, which then gets the flip side. That's like the lower things here in sort of the spiritual life of the community. It gets turned around to liberty, life, liberty, and with our 1776 theme, and the pursuit of happiness, higher things, making a becoming use of what is your own then, and pursuing proper objects, estimating proper objects. These are three different concepts of justice in Smith: commutative, distributive, and estimative. But it's all about that inversion of the focus that I spoke of towards the lower things and letting people more. And then we got, bam, the great enrichment, as Deirdre McCloskey calls it. Bam, the blade of the hockey stick starts shooting up. This is magic. That's what emerged. Now, about its name. As Helena points out, the term liberal, the adjective liberal, had an ancient history. It meant the virtues becoming a free person, hence liberal arts, liberal sciences, liberal professions, and it also meant generous, just as you say. So those are sort of non-political meanings, but then suddenly it took a political meaning, and for the first time. And I think the real originator here has to be credited to William Robertson, who in this book started using it in precisely this way. You can see that it's a kind of a deliberate move. I won't go over these quotations, but you see it happening here. Now, William Robertson was a big deal in his day, but he didn't have the huge influence that Adam Smith had. Smith doesn't use the word in this political way in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. He does use it in the letter in 1774, but then it's really in 1776 that he decides, yeah, we're going to go with this. And there are a number of signal passages. I'm going to show you two of them. In this one, he talks about two broad outlooks in politics, one that he associates with the French minister Colbert, whose words in red there represent the Colbert view. He thought of the economy with a system of restraint and regulation and endeavored to organize the commerce of a country upon the same model as the departments of a public office, a very organizational view of the economy. He bestowed upon certain branches of industry extraordinary privileges while he laid others under as extraordinary restraints. So that's one broad view. And then he says, then there's this other view. And what is that view? Allowing every man to pursue his own interest, his own way. And that's an expression he uses also when he sets out the system of natural liberty. And he says, of course, that you can't mess with other people's stuff, but otherwise you're basically free to allow pursue your own interest, your own way. And what's the name of that? The liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice. So he's got these two broad things, and he's got the one that he's for and propounding for 900 pages, and that's the liberal plan. And then here he talks about the liberal system of free enterprise and its virtues, particularly in preventing famines. He discusses that, and then he says, unfortunately, very few countries have entirely adopted this liberal system. He's reinforcing this terminology here. These are signal moments. There are other important moments in the Wealth of Nations with the word liberal being put to this political use. We won't go through them. And in correspondence, right after the book came out, congratulations from friends, including Robertson himself, you see them picking right up on the word liberal in their correspondence about the Wealth of Nations. So that's my cherry picking, right? That's my quotations. Eleanor's got her quotations. I got my quotations. How do we really know? Well, I suggest that something we should give great weight to here is big data. Here's how we really know, in my view. These engrams, these 2 grams, liberal principles, liberal policy, ideas, system, government, plan, they come exactly when I say, they sustain themselves. This is a remarkable burgeoning of this liberal talk. Here's liberal in its first and original political meaning. You can stick those 2 grams into the engram viewer in 15 seconds and make this picture on your computer. And just to make sure that it's not because, well, maybe people started using the adjective liberal a lot, like we started talking about my liberal shoes or this nice liberal door. Like maybe that, no, it's actually exactly these 2 grams or collocations that are picking up the percentage points of the collocations, the 2 collocations with the adjective liberal. So this is total confirmation. Another total confirmation is that students and I have looked at all of the works of all of Smith's contemporaries and predecessors at the Liberty Fund site. That doesn't mean it's all their works, but it's an awful lot. None of them are doing liberal in this political sense, again, until Robertson and Smith. There's a couple in Hume that are quite interesting, but it's just a couple. And then, of course, so you have these expressions, liberal policy, liberal principles, liberal government, liberal plan, and then, of course, the noun comes, the ism, and that starts mopping up usage, and the other ones decline. That's a natural progression when isms finally come. And it's in the parliamentary history of England. You can look at the parliamentary debates. Right here, it starts just like we've been saying. Look how it peaks right after the Wealth of Nations. It's sustained liberal in this political sense. These are not just any uses of liberal. This is specifically this political usage. The king even uses it. Dugald Stewart uses it. He was a very big wheel in Edinburgh. He uses it in a pretty clear, deliberate way in his works. And he spawns the Edinburgh Review. These guys who made and did the Edinburgh Review, which was a super influential journal, were very much influenced by Dugald Stewart. And we see it's actually this blue line here, the sustained usage and occurrence of liberal in this political sense, and then this Edinburgh Review got read all throughout Europe. McCulloch goes kind of crazy in this way, using the word about 12 times in this particular entry in Encyclopedia Britannica. It's kind of interesting. Okay, now, what I'm saying, Helena pointed out that they weren't necessarily enthusiastic about democracy. That's true. That's really true. But I'd go further. They were about policy reform. They weren't really about polity formation per se. Smith wasn't. The Wealth of Nations, the book isn't. It's not about constitutional reform. It's not about the electorate. It's not about those issues. Dugald Stewart says, the progress already made in political economy has been sufficient to show that the happiness of mankind depends not on the share which the people possess in enactment of laws, but on the equity and expedience of the laws that are enacted. The most celebrated works of Smith and others aimed at improving society not by delineating plans of new constitutions, but by enlightening the policy of actual legislators. There's got to be a legislator and a stable political system to be an advisor to a legislator and a stable political system. Britain had that in a special way. People don't realize that. It's really important to see that. France, Germany, Britain, Italy, you name it. It wasn't quite like that. So something's happening and being done in Britain which just can't really even happen on the continent. So this liberal plan presupposes something that we are so accustomed to today because we swim in it, like the water we swim in or the air we breathe, integrated and stable polity. And as I say, it didn't come directly with the Glorious Revolution. It took some decades, as this famous historian shows. He calls it adamantine, diamond-like, only by about 1725. And this was very special to Britain. So you see, all this I think is important because this island nation is really special in this respect, and you've got to understand that to see the special character of Smith's liberalism, in my view. It kind of creates in Smith's works and the other works around him and then following him, the aspiration of a liberal nation state, essentially. And if you look at something like this time-lapse video on YouTube, it's quite interesting to see how over 1,000 years the borders and the colors change here very dramatically. Britain sits up there with very, very little change. That's just one reflection of what I'm saying here. But it is kind of a sobering thing to watch. Helena notes that liberals everywhere worried about the power of the state. But then she writes, the German liberals, however, did not have a state. And that needs to be really kept in mind. So we have a distinction here between policy reform within a stable polity, like we're accustomed to today, like Timbro is engaged in, policy reform, policy discussion. What should what should Parliament do? Versus polity reformation. And on the continent, they were practically in perpetual crisis in these matters, and so continental liberals were beset with conquests and wars, sometimes boundary and border disputes, ethnic and religious conflict, empires, of course, constitutional change, which is happening to some extent in Britain too, with things like the reform bills and the expansion of the electorate, but that's kind of a calm and deliberate and gradual thing. More dramatic in other cases, such as when we have revolutions and secessions and the church-state issues, which loom much larger on the continent. And so liberals on the continent often had to throw in with the lesser evil. They're not in this luxurious position of just having a stable nation state and then doing their policy, like being the economist and being the policy analyst and doing, hey, what would be good for universal benevolence? And they figure out, let's make these reforms. they often have to be watching over their back to see what's going on. They're worried about the next revolution. They're worried about the next big change. So they're often throwing in with sort of the lesser evil. They're actually being persecuted often. Tocqueville noted the distinction here in Britain and the specialness in Britain in this respect, but I won't go into it. So now to step back, so those works, Robertson and The Wealth of Nations, were first of all read on the continent in English, but also had some translations, sometimes only partial, quite early, and started working their effect. We saw this in English with these expressions. Let's now do 4 other languages. Google Scholar has German, Italian, French, and Spanish. So do these expressions come? When do they come? Well, they do come, but they come later. In fact, almost 3 decades later. Here's France. They come and they continue, but it takes a while. It takes quite a while. And Spain, same thing. Italy, the same thing. Germany, the same thing. This is political liberalism in its early discussions, but we see that they've basically imported it from Britain. And if we drill down and see who's actually doing this, it very often is people like Say, a strong Smithian and economist in France, Jovellanos, a leader of the liberales in Spain, and Adlaspara, the famous Adlaspara, who was a strong Smithian and an avid admirer and translator of Smith. In fact, if you look at continental liberals, they often, a number of them actually did sojourns in Britain, often in their youth, which I think were influential for them, just as it was for Voltaire and Montesquieu, the 2 great Anglophiles of the French Enlightenment. And Constant, whom Helena rightly highlights, this was important for. Say, Tocqueville, the great Eric Gustave Yeager, right, in 1809 and 1810, soaked up British experience and then, had his official defection to liberalism some years later. And others. This is a very incomplete list. I've not done this too thoroughly. So people like Constant, in my view, were, again, beset with issues of polity reformation. But, his aspiration, I think, was to get to a stable polity where they could do what? Liberal policy reform. What was Constant for? He was for things Adam Smith was for, free markets, generally speaking, smaller government in most areas, and so on. Allowing every man to pursue his own interest his own way. Now, things do go differently, and there's like a watershed crisis that comes, and even a collapse of liberalism. Carl Polanyi would be one voice describing this change, and he says it's because liberalism failed. I don't buy that, but at any rate, it's clear that there is a watershed in political thinking. Terms like these that express and reflect and indeed inculcate a mentality of the governmentalization of social affairs come. It's kind of amazing that these terms like social justice had no currency in English before about 1880, 1890. This is the watershed period, in fact. And then they continue, and of course, government starts to grow and continues to grow enormously. This is just one way of showing that. And these central words, I would argue, often lost or changed meaning, including the word liberal itself, as I've explored at this website. Nothing shows this more simply than something that Helena referred to, and that's that right from this period that I'm talking about, from about 1880, people start having to distinguish between new liberal and old liberal, or new liberalism and old liberalism. And we see the engrams reflected from the works, the millions of books at Google Books. You might think of 3 faces here of liberalism. liberalism 1.0, democracy in general, just voting, kind of regardless of what that guy there is voting for. And then later, big government, as Helena put it, the governmentalization of social affairs. These are three of the famous new liberals in Britain. John Dewey, of course, was very, very important and influential in the United States. Joseph Stiglitz is just a progressive Nobel economist in America now. So in summary, I do think that liberalism 1.0, well, first of all, I think it's very real and cogent. We can debate how to interpret Adam Smith, but I guess we need some more hours for that. But it is actually a modern emergence in the sense that it's since the printing press. So in that sense, it's modern. It's related to that natural jurisprudence that I talked about, maintains this presumption of allowing every man to pursue his own interest his own way, presupposing an integrated, stable polity, which Britain almost uniquely had the luxurious position of. Best understood, therefore, as a policy reform outlook, much like what Timbro does day in and day out. Paramount figure Adam Smith declined dramatically after about 1880. I think language subversion followed, and today I think it's apt to call it classical liberalism. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So what are we to make of this? Now we are confused on a higher level. I think this is great. But one thing that struck me, just one from many things, is that you pointed out that there wasn't really, come up, Dan, there wasn't really anything like Germany. They didn't have a country. Still, you could say that many of the liberal thinkers have their origin in the German culture, you say. I am reading Hegel right now. You could say Hayek, a number of people coming from the German culture. So wouldn't that be countering your idea that you point to Britain and perhaps Sweden as more insular?
Not only
cultures.
Hayek, but also Hegel comes after Smith, right? So
that's the important thing, coming after Smith.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I'm not saying you can't be liberal in your outlook without a stable nation state. I don't want to say that. I'm just saying that this emergence, as I called it, of Smithian liberalism, if you will, was like a very real thing and super influential, almost kind of exemplary, I would say. And then naturally, there's some national invidiousness involved in that, right? I would want to be like those Brits, or yes, we're the Brits, and that kind of thing. And that complicates things, and in fact might inhibit things. But where are the German liberals prior to Smith? Who are they?
Yeah, that's the question. Helena, now, time to debate.
Okay, well, you see I've scribbled here. So, and what do I have, 5 minutes? I better talk fast, so hold on to your seats. So Dan here has done exactly what I said you shouldn't do if you're a historian. He has decided what liberalism is. For him, there's a true liberalism. It's classical liberalism. He is a fan of Hayek. He admits it. So there is for him a true and a real liberalism. And I say that that's anachronistic. He's using that term, and he's using it to do something unhistorical. He uses Adam Smith, and recent scholarship on Adam Smith shows actually that he was for a whole bunch of government intervention. So when he talks about liberal policy or liberal this and liberal that, I don't think it's correct to say that what he's talking about is don't mess with other people's stuff, which is a refrain we hear often from Dan, that it's about commutative justice. And a lot of what you talk about, Dan, is in fact economics and not politics. They were constitution builders. If you look at Benjamin Constant, he wrote a constitution. In Germany, they were concerned about writing constitutions and creating constitutions, so their economic thought is one aspect. And I think that as a historian, we need to, and what I tell my students is, the past is a strange place, and we have to keep that in mind. We can't just read thinkers and think we understand them. We need to understand the context, and we need to try to get at their intentions. It's difficult, but if you look at Adam Smith, he wrote before Industrial Revolution. He wrote again at a time when the aristocracy were in control of government. So of course you want to dismantle obstructions to the economy and so on, because the laws are being made by aristocrats. And they are, if you give them more power, they're going to tax the poor, which is exactly what they did. So you want to attack these obstructions, but we don't know what Adam Smith would say today. I mean, like, how can we possibly know what he would say today? Voila, so that's one thing. No, so I wanted to tell you that the things Adam Smith, he talked about public health, he talked about public works, public education, he spoke about bridges, roads, all sorts of things that for the 18th century were quite interventionist. And my guys, or the new liberals that you don't like so much, and you use this word, what is it that you use? Decline of liberalism or collapse of liberalism. He sneaks in these terms, that like decline of liberalism, that's you. You're saying that there was a decline. At the time, people were articulating liberalism. And many of them said that they were the inheritors of Adam Smith's vision. They were being true. The new liberals were being true. Even a socialist like Beatrice Webb, or proto-socialist I should call her, said something at one point like, how in the world did Adam Smith become some kind of advocate of free trade? So you can read Adam Smith. Differently. He's reading him through, I think, Hayekian eyes. Printing. You say that printing is so important to liberalism. But printing is important to authoritarianism, to counter-revolution. They use the printing press. They spread printing. So what's so essential about printing that that helps liberalism along? Yeah, we needed it, but so did the propagandists of the absolute monarchy. Let me see, what am I going to say next? Like, I don't deny, again, your engrams. I love engrams. I was going to include one in my book, and somehow it didn't get there. I totally like engrams, but you have this where you say liberal policy, liberal, whatever, liberal, all this liberal. But the point is, what did they mean by this? And I don't think they were just talking about the economy. They weren't. They were talking about constitutions. And by the way, one of the things Dan never talks about is religion. And the word liberal was used enormously by people to talk about liberal Protestantism, for example, which was at the time a synonym for something kind of like Unitarianism, a religion that didn't have so many ceremonies or so many dogmas, but that focused on being moral in the world. William Robertson, who you quote, who you use a lot, was a pastor, right, in the church. Adam Smith taught moral philosophy. Benjamin Constant wrote a 5-volume book on religion, where he talks about it, that a liberal polity needs a liberal religion. So when you talk about liberal policy, liberal this and that, what are they really talking about? I believe there's still that generosity in there, and that at a certain point in the 19th and 20th century, they stopped saying that it's enough for noblemen to be liberal. It's not enough, It's not enough for individuals to be liberal. It's not enough for this generosity of a noble, what it meant in past. What we need now is government to be generous. We need a generous government. because it's not enough that we have private charity. They used it in Tocqueville. You find it in Tocqueville. He talks about private charity not being enough. We need public charity. So, and the 19th century, you didn't talk so much about that, but normally classical liberals refer to the 19th century as, I'm finished, Bjorn. And one more thing. 19th century liberals often speak classical liberals often speak of the 19th century as the heyday of classical liberalism. This was apparently the time when there were free markets. But that's nonsense. If you look like freedom for whom? For wealthy white men. Look at slavery. Isn't that government intervention? How about the laws against women? That wasn't government intervention. It is government intervention all over the place. So it's simply not true. There are thousands of laws literally passed in America. They happen to be passed by state governments and not by the federal government, but that's government intervention. A lot of laws favoring the rich. And how about factory owners? You call out the troops to put down strikes. I call that intervention. Should I stop there?
Okay. Great points. On that last one, yeah, there's no claim that the heyday, if you like, of liberalism 1.0, it's really a kind of heyday, you might say 100, 150 years, depending on when you want to start and end it. You certainly want to end it around 1880, 1890. It's not about there having been any comprehensive liberal policy. It's about the trend of reform, the trend of thinking, a kind of intellectual ascendancy, kind of respect. So that's what I mean. I mean, no one's claiming that there was comprehensive liberal policy during those years. Obviously, they were not. But what was the trend? What did it look like 25 years ago? And very often it looked less liberal 25 years ago. So yeah, I do discriminate between meanings of the word liberal. I mean, I don't go around using the term true so much, but I think some meanings are more worthy than others, and I very much affirm the liberalism 1.0 meaning. So I kind of confess that. It's not a big admission. I was never hiding it. So, you know. The whole matter of Adam Smith and how to read him, it's great that comes into this. That it's remarkable how important that's becoming, the debate between left and classical liberal, if you will, Smithians. And there's a very lively and rich discussion going on. I think it's rather civil. And there's disagreement about how much government intervention Smith tolerated or even favored. And I do think the left Smithians are greatly overplaying their hand on this. This is another matter for longer discussion. But it's true, he by no means was a minimal statist, okay, a pure night watchman state guy. That's totally true. But still, overall, the spirit is towards liberalizing, I would say, from where we are. And he was oriented towards the status quo. Just like his friends Hume and Burke, kind of like here's where we are, where do we want to go? And by and large, Smith wants to go in that liberalization direction, I feel. There are exceptions, and there are some standing interventions that he actually endorsed, but those he treats as exceptions, as exceptional. Those are the by and large exceptions, you know, the exceptions to the by and large. So, I mean, Helena makes the case that the new liberals, okay, the left liberals of the 1880s, 1890s into the 20th century, that they are just as much the true liberals because they're sort of true to the same ends that, if you want to put it this way, the same ends that Adam Smith always had in view, the well-being of society and so on. It's just that times have changed, and so now we have to adapt the means, and now in these new times, that means these other things, which we hear the left advocating. Well, everybody is for increasing the well-being of society. I don't think this has ever been an issue. It's never been a distinguishing characteristic. I think everybody who's been participating in the civilization and carrying on discussion has been looking for that and discussing that. So that's not really a way to discriminate between liberals and anyone else, I don't see. in terms of actually defining meaningful categories and identities, I think that what kinds of means you tend to favor is the useful way to draw lines. And I do think that the new liberals are favoring means that differ from the old liberals. And so there is a real difference there, in my view. And as I showed you, people from 1880 started seeing the need to distinguish between old and new liberal. It didn't come after World War II. They started doing it right when it happened, right when the change came. So let me just finally say, Helena said, like, today we need a generous government. Okay, now we'll get down to politics a little bit. You know, if you think about the welfare state, and you get out the microscope, and when we talk about it being generous, and you get out the microscope and you start looking at each person in the whole process. Okay, let's look at the politician. Was he generous in favoring an expansion of the welfare state? Was the taxpayer generous? Like, where exactly is the generosity? Like, help me with this. Where was the show of, where was the action, the generous action? The voter, where was the voter generous? Okay, where was the administrator, the civil servant who takes the applications and maybe writes the checks? Where is the generosity? Where is the generosity in this system? And I think it's actually untrue to the moral system that was taught by Adam Smith and others like him to say that the state is being generous with the welfare state, or that really anybody is. If somebody is, you tell me who it is. I'd like to know and hear and see that. But anyhow, I'll close with that.
I just want to make one point. I don't think, you see, you like slipped something in there. I don't think that I said that the state should be generous. I really try to keep myself out of it. I really try to keep myself, have a distance. I said that the new liberals thought, FDR thought, he speaks about it all the time. So it's not my politics. I may believe that or I may not, but I'm trying to, have distance from history.
Okay, thanks. Time for some questions from the audience. Short questions, and please say your name as well.
Thank you. Fredrik Lindholm here. When did the Vatican start to talk about natural law? Because hearing these presentations, I draw the conclusion that the Vatican start to talk about natural law in order to nerf or to hamstring the liberals. Is that true or right? True or not? Not that I personally believe in natural rights, I'm just curious.
Well, you want to go? Well, I mean, natural law, natural right actually goes all the way back to the Spanish Catholics, right? You have the schools in Salamanca who talk about natural right, natural law. So there's a long tradition of natural law thinking that comes from within the Catholic tradition, whether that's the Pope or not, I'm not 100% sure. But there's a intellectual powerhouse there that goes far back into the Renaissance. I believe that now, I don't know if you've read Sam Moyn. Sam Moyn's written this book about the human rights, for example, which is based on this natural law idea. And he says, and I think there's truth to this, that in the middle of the 20th century, actually, again with the rise of totalitarianism, the Pope, the Vatican starts speaking about religious toleration, starts accepting liberalism, starts accepting these concepts as an anti-communist thing, as an anti-socialism thing. So it's actually a conservative move by the Pope. That's Sam Moyn's view, and I think I agree with that. I don't know if I answered your question quite, but.
Yeah. Any comments from you? Okay.
I'm not sure you even got it, so let's go on.
Yep.
Okay, Per, my name is Per, and this kind of goes out to Dan a bit, but you can also. I liked your cross-references and everything, but one thing I wonder a little bit, except for the polity reform and policy reform, if you also go back to Britain, France, and you had empires in Britain, you had, well, all those could apply to, but did you do any cross-reference between the defense of the defending the system and trying to do liberalism within that system, or trying to create a new system that was liberal?
Yeah, those. If you're having to defend the system, you're beset by some kind of issues, dangers, right? Of polity reformation, as I call it. So whether it's internal or external, you've got serious issues there. You do not have stable polity, right? So you're saying, does it matter whether it's internal or external?
In a way.
It matters. I mean, of course, it's going to matter to some things, but to my basic point, no, I don't think so. The main point I'm trying to make is that after Britain, goes through the 17th century, it emerges in the early 18th century with a very stable polity. And when you start getting this division of labor among intellectuals and statesmen and so on, and you get the development of this, natural jurisprudence flows into political economy. And then the Wealth of Nations is this momentous, monumental contribution and kind of paradigmatic statement, kind of propounding and putting forward, advancing that whole idea of like a political economy system. It was hugely influential. Not that there wasn't a lot of political economy before, but it really was super and immediately influential, the Wealth of Nations. And it is something in terms of the scale and the sort of comprehensiveness that Smith takes in that book that does kind of depend on Britain's stable polity status, you see. He doesn't have to worry about revolutions and invasions and conquests and empires and the Pope. So he gets down to this modern view of sort of like the policy of a modern nation state.
I took your question to mean within a liberal constitution or government, were there liberals arguing within it, like more liberal or less liberal? So, for example, in 1830 revolution in France, the liberals really come to power. There has been this wave of reaction to the revolution, but they fight back and they come back. And the 1830 revolution is considered a victory for liberals. It's all over the newspapers. But they soon break into moderate liberals, progressive liberals, if you want. What do they call them? Movement liberals. And conservative liberals. They talk about, now François Guizot, for example, is considered a conservative liberal. He just wants to keep the Constitution of 1830. Other liberals, calling themselves liberals, saying, no, we have to make more reforms. We have to have greater freedom of press because he clamps down on the press. We have to have a wider electorate. So, among the liberals, there is this argument. And this comes, you find it in Germany. Again, they're all talking about France. You get this, I found it in Yair. I was reading Yair, your edition, and there's movement liberals he talks about. Mm-hmm. He's got to be talking about France, movement liberals, and he seems to be favorable, which means liberals who are trying to liberalize more. In the political realm, sorry, no pointing.
Okay, thanks. We have time for one last or two short questions. If you say your question, I'll take question number 2 then.
Hi, my name is Jesper Alin Marcheta. I have a question for Professor Rosenblatt. I read and appreciated your book a lot, although I'm missing a little bit about the German contributions to liberalism in the 19th century. You mentioned briefly that what they brought to the table here. I wonder if you could say something more about that.
Okay, I think we take question number 2 as well. Yeah.
Okay, yes. Hello, my name is Sebastian Nordlund. I would actually like the both of you to elaborate a bit on the importance of David Hume for the history of liberalism, other than his theory of knowledge or skepticism, as it is usually defined, leading to more let's say, moral terms with a lesser scope, less abstracted, hypostatic ideas, whatever you would call it. Yes.
So first, on you want me to go first? Please. On Germany, thank you, Jesper. We've been having a Twitter exchange, right? Yeah. Where was I? Germany. So the Germans in the middle of the 19th century, and I'm not talking about Kant or Hegel, actually. I'm talking about a bunch of political economists who said that, look, what's going on in England with Ricardo and Malthus and Adam, these thinkers are too abstract. They draw graphs and they make predictions about laissez-faire and how everything's going to be fine. But the truth is, if you look at the cities that are industrializing, if you look at the poor and the workers, they are stuck in poverty. They are not rising. Laissez-faire policies are not working the way these economists are saying. Moreover, they also say human beings are not just motivated by self-interest. They are not just interested in making money. Human beings have a moral side. And so we can work on that to improve the lives of all. And you know, in America, in 19th century, sorry, you get so excited, I keep going. 19th century America, thousands of students went to Germany to study in the universities. They were considered the best universities in the world, and there were hardly any worth going to in America, right? And they translated these people in German, in even, maybe not Edinburgh Review, but in other ones, they translated them, and these ideas spread. Yes? Got it.
I can just say that Hume's super important. Smith is very true to Hume. I almost see them as, I think Smith, this is neither here nor there in terms of all the liberalism, but I think that Smith definitely develops on Hume in important ways, both in political economy and in moral theory. But I think Hume actually smiled on it all. I don't think there was any real space between them at all. And I think modern scholars have now started a trend of actually trying to drive wedges between Hume and Smith, which I don't think are pretty much never right, in my view. But we can talk about Hume maybe over wine or something.
I think I missed the question here. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Gina Gustafsson, I'm a political theorist in Uppsala and Oxford, and I want to emphatically applaud Helena's project of trying to unravel the European history of liberalism. My question is about the elephant in the room for many people today, which is national identity. I noticed that you began by painting the same picture as Yasha Monk, for example, has painted recently, and many others, of rising populism, rising authoritarianism, but you didn't, as Yasha Monk, for example, or Yael Tamir, an Israeli political theorist, turn to sort of inclusive patriotism as the potential remedy. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on this, especially since there is this thriving literature on liberal nationalism, which I myself am working on with David Miller, and of course, I'm therefore very curious to hear your thoughts on this based on your project.
Right. So I would say you're most definitely more of an expert on this, it sounds, than I am. But I would say, so we can talk about it more over drinks, but I would say that patriotism and nationalism are two different things. I think that liberals, my liberals in any case, were quite cosmopolitan, believed in open borders. Of course, they didn't have the kind of problems we have today. They believed in patriotism, but there is no contradiction between patriotism and individual rights and so on. I think they believed in it as a morally uplifting thing, as a binding thing. People like Madame de Staël and Benjamin Constant were worried that when you got rid of the aristocracy or the whole aristocratic order, including the morals attached to it. Honor, for example, was a big deal for aristocracy. You know, if you read Montesquieu, for example, they were worried that society was going to fall apart. There was going to be atomisms, individuals that are selfish, that are unmoored. So you needed something to bind them. Religion was one, this kind of transcendental religion, not one particular sect or another, and patriotism of a certain, commitment to the common good. Right? But not this exclusive nationalism, xenophobia, closed borders. That I don't see in any of my guys.
I do think that there's plenty of space for love of country, patriotism, a kind of favoritism. Like I root for the Williams sisters whenever I watch one of the Grand Slams. They're Americans, of course I root for them. That I think is very appropriate to liberalism, whomever we look at it, but we do see it, I think, very plainly in Smith and the theory of moral sentiments, about the different circles of association and sympathy in society, starting from the family, going to the neighborhood, the friends, and outwards, and he talks about the country, and that's very natural. And also, let me say that kind of maybe in something you've encountered is that some communitarian critics or theorists like to paint liberals as like so anti that. I think that's it's generally not sound, and it's certainly not sound of the guys I'm emphasizing. Like it's just, I don't know, there's like too much of this, the abstract individual and liberalism and liberal political theory and social contract. Smith and Hume both rejected social contract. They were the good Enlightenment. They were the true Enlightenment. Here I go again, right? And somehow, other ideas of the Enlightenment get a lot of attention and also criticism, but still elevation. And I think that's kind of unfortunate. But anyway, I don't know what to say. It's a very, very interesting topic. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think we've come to an end. It has been so good to have you both here, and it shows the discussion that liberalism and liberal values and everything is really something still alive, and that we have to discuss it also in this time where populism is rising, as you started to say. One funny little thing in relation to the last question is that when I, together with Dan, did the translation of the Erik Gustav Geijer texts, the great Swedish 19th century liberal, we actually had a financial contribution by the Swedish Royal Patriotic Society. So and I think Geijer spoke about patriotism as a good value in a time of change in the 19th century. Thanks to both of you. A little gift.
Thank you very much. It's lovely. Thank you.
Thanks. And now the discussion continues outside. Thanks.